All right, everybody's starting to fill in from break. We have an incredible panel here for you today. A group of folks who have been in digital health for a long time. Will be talking about whether or not it is a pro, a con, something in the middle to be a first mover in the space. And I think some of the folks here have been first movers and some second or third. So I think this is a panel for you if you really want to get into it, and that's what we plan to do today. So I am Chrissy Faw. I'm an investor with OMERS Ventures, invested in health tech. Prior to that, a reporter for about a decade. So know many of these folks here from a prior life. And I wanted to start off by kicking a question over to Sean, to my left, CEO of Omada Health. And Sean may remember when he and I first met that he was quite confident that his company, which was selling diabetes prevention solutions, would sell into Medicare. That was one of the first conversations we had. He was like, it's coming around the corner, it's going to happen. And it has been more than 10 years. And Sean, tell me, are you selling into Medicare?
It's amazing. So hi, everybody. Sean Duffy, co-founder and CEO of a virtual care company, Omada. So I am battle-hardened now. Any good news that appears to be that thing that is just going to, oh my gosh, transform the company, I tend to come in with skepticism. And I think that's the appropriate mindset for any of you founders out there. Medicare was one of those funny examples where there was some momentum about actually reimbursing for virtual and in-person diabetes prevention programs. But at the end of the day, at that point in time, which Chrissy's referring to, CMS made the decision to only reimburse in person. And that decision has still stood the test of time, but never say never. Every year we revisit. So long game.
And I think how that relates to first mover is that you were kind of a first mover in this space. And if it does happen, if all the efforts pay off and Medicare does cover, then you might be in a position where a bunch of other folks kind of continue to flood in.
That's right.
Cool. Okay, moving on. Julia, I would say, would you say you're a first mover? I would kind of say yes and no.
I would agree, yes and no. There were several ahead of us, but first mover in terms of tweaking the model.
And I think one of your potential kind of real first movers is actually sitting to your left. Would you agree?
Totally agree.
Former CEO of Ancestry.
Yeah, Ancestry, 23andMe, really the normalization of putting a biological sample in the mail and sending it somewhere, made that normal. A good 10 years, really, before we even existed.
Okay, so tell me about the insight at Everlywell, the original name of the company. How did you, knowing that these predecessors existed, like Ancestry, like 23andMe, how did you decide that your company still needed to exist? Because there were kind of similar ideas out there. Was it something kind of novel around just putting the pieces together in a new way?
Yeah, and I'm Julia Cheek, CEO and founder of Everly Health, originally founded Everlywell in 2015. For us, there were a lot of different types of models out there for getting consumers access to lab testing. There was concierge medicine, direct-to-consumer blood draws, 23andMe and Ancestry. And so this wasn't a novel concept. And actually, one of our main value propositions was that we weren't doing anything novel. We were reinventing the care delivery around testing, but not the testing itself. And it certainly was a challenge, of course, to educate on things like cholesterol testing in the home, hormone testing in the home, things that are not as shiny and weren't as compelling for people to do every day. But it was something that we felt could really speak to a large population of Americans. To be honest, when I started the company, it was really for people in my demographic, women from 25 to 40 that were often overlooked, didn't have access to these services, but it widely became really an American problem a few years after that. But it wasn't something that I think was particularly novel, which is why I say I think in our particular assembling of it, we were a first mover, but there were many other companies that predated us that really paved the way.
And before we move on, I just wanted to double click on one other kind of early, really important part of your journey, which was being on Shark Tank, which I believe you did in 2017. And not many people remember this. But from the conversations you and I have had, you've said that this was a really important moment. Can you share more about that, especially in the context of why the storytelling piece was so important for you as somebody that was trying to put together the pieces in a new way, but not build something that didn't exist?
Yeah, so I thought it was fairly common knowledge that I had been on Shark Tank. Chrissy has told me it's her new trivia fact. So I was, in fact, on Shark Tank in 2017 and actually spent the better part of a year strategically trying to get on the show because we felt that if Americans knew that this solution existed, it would be a light bulb moment. And that is, in fact, what happened. But one unpredictable thing that happened is that there were executives from the largest brick and mortar retail in the US, as well as from the largest Medicare plan in the US, both of whom pitched me about 2 or 3 weeks afterward. And we ended up launching both of those channels within the next 6 months with those clients. And so there are certain ways to think about how you can even expand your model in areas that we frankly didn't even know existed, especially on the Medicare side. And so for us, it changed the company overnight in a number of ways. And it became something that was known and accessible by hundreds of millions of Americans instead of a small niche group that were looking to do specific things.
We tell HLTH for next year that we want to do a panel on how you got onto Shark Tank. Exactly.
Yeah, I've had to actually do quite a bit of advising for people who are interested in the path. I recommend it. I really do.
Margot, I'm going to throw this question your way. So we've talked a lot behind the scenes on whether or not it is actually helpful to be a first mover in healthcare, and I think there's reasons to believe that it isn't, because it is so hard to do things that are truly novel in this space. Can you share a little bit more about your journey, both as a founder CEO now, but then everything you did at Ancestry, which really didn't exist previously, and I think you had to face a lot of the brunt of that.
Yeah, I do agree that we talked, a bunch of us separately, about this concept of not just first mover, but first right mover. So whether it was my time at Google or my time at Ancestry, you learn so much about, it's not about being first, but it's really about having that incredible clarity of what is the value that you're creating for the world and where is that acceleration potential, whether it's Google search or at Ancestry, which when we originally started out doing things like genetic testing, what we were doing is really creating a feeder that made it easier for people to on-ramp into their ancestral journey, because you got these nuggets of inspiration that then motivated you to go on. But the real breakthrough came when we could connect those family trees and the concept of your genomics to bring even more magic. So we made the journey easier, and we could also tell you not just that you were related to people, but who was that relative. And so that became a breakthrough, very similar to what we're doing at Montai. There's lots of companies that are looking at AI or have gone on a journey looking at natural products. We're not taking the world that way. We're making a leap to something more important, which is how do we start with the end in mind? We have a chronic disease tsunami sitting in front of us, and yet we have therapies that are not safe for long-term use and earlier intervention. And what we really need to do is think differently about how AI can enable us to make leaps in the development of therapies that we all want. I'm a parent of a child that suffered for over 20 years with one of these chronic diseases. And how do we actually think about identifying the pathways that underlie these diseases? We've spent 20, 30 years understanding these. How do we actually identify therapies that have the highest provenance to be safe for long-term use and earlier intervention? And how do we create a platform that makes it predictable to do that for as many diseases as possible? And so that was the crazy journey we started on, which is a much bigger problem, which sounds a little scary, but we're making it happen, and it's really exciting to be advancing therapies now to market.
Excellent. Stephen, looking at you now, because you're with Verily, but you've had a career that has spanned industries outside of healthcare. So being a first mover in healthcare versus other industries, what's your hot take? Is it harder in healthcare? Is it easier in healthcare? How does it compare?
Yeah, it's interesting to share coming into the industry perspective. I've been at Verily. Verily used to be Google Life Sciences. We spun out of Alphabet, Google X in 2015. So we're about 8 years old. And coming in, I'd spent a career in tech and a decade in retail. And what I had found coming in was almost that big tech and big retail had solved a lot of the problems that big healthcare is struggling with on behavior. Think of loyalty programs of the most successful retailers, Starbucks, Best Buy, the airlines. They're very well tuned in managing behavior and driving behavior to do things that both add value to the consumer, but also to the brand. And then the use of technology triangulates the ability for you to add value, get insights and learning. And what I had found in healthcare was there's a lot of data, a lot of information. And I talked about earlier, the information are like power plants. The power plants are there, but the power lines connecting them are down. And if you could build a company and a capability that helps connect the power lines to the information and the insights that are in industry, then you can have a chance to really fulfill some of the things we're seeing at the conference about the future of care, the role technology has to play. And I think Verily, with partners, because no company can do it alone, is well positioned to advance that.
So you're of the mind that it is in some ways more challenging because this industry is 10 to 15 years behind where others are.
Yeah, I think it's a great time for all of our companies and others because I think there's an appetite to embrace the change. You're always going to have it in the industry, the status quo being protected by many people. But I think right now there's enough of the large established players, new entrants to the market, and an investment community that are backing disruptive change for this to be a time like no other that companies can really have an impact to change that curve or change the arc of how healthcare has been delivered, particularly in the U.S. In the near term, it doesn't need to be 20 years out.
Okay, another little bit of health tech trivia. I'm pretty sure, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, Sean, that you coined the phrase digital therapeutics.
I think I did. I'm 95% sure.
You did now.
I was on a panel. I remember it ages ago. I was on a panel, and there was a company, really neat company, that was building a digital Alzheimer's diagnostic. And at that point in time, I remember building this mental model of like, wow, you're like a digital diagnostic, and we're like a digital therapeutic. Now, we don't describe our company in that way anymore for a whole host of reasons. But that, to my knowledge, was the genesis.
Okay, amazing. So I didn't embarrass myself by making that claim. So let's get into digital therapeutics, because I would say this is a space where it's been really tough to be a first mover. And I think there are a lot of folks now that are wondering if there is going to be a big win in the digital therapeutics area. Perhaps there will be, but that company may need to learn the lessons of what others have had to learn the hard way. What do you think, as someone who clearly had some early insight and was looking at this industry from when it really got off the ground?
Yeah, and so Omada quickly realized, especially in the early days, that look, at the end of the day, we're personalizing our care programs with people. Then we started to expand from pre-diabetes and weight to diabetes to hypertension. We started to go down paths such as getting NCQA accreditation, really providing care services. We started contracting as a provider. And I'm like, the therapeutics analogy, though I said it on that panel, was the wrong one. Now, that being said, I hope digital therapeutics as an industry can recover from the recent headwinds. I think in theory it's possible. There's a product challenge in that I don't think it works to have digital therapeutics with people components. So for instance, if it's software only, or if it's a VR experience that has some therapeutic output, that more closely resembles the life sciences therapeutics model of its a molecule that is the same for this person as that person, doesn't involve a services layer. So there's a product issue. So I think it's like, how do you define the right product type for digital therapeutics? And then there's this entire piping issue from the reimbursement, the coverage. You can't take this to the FDA and get coverage and run it through the PBMs and set your WAC and all the things that the manufacturers of traditional therapeutics would do. And then there's this big go-to-market challenge in that if you're a pharmaceutical manufacturer and you're working to add awareness, you will not even enter a market unless there's sufficient coverage. So usually the rule of thumb is you've got to have about 50% plus of any patient walking through a door to actually get provider activation. And so you've never been able to do that. So it's this quagmire of wrong product, no infrastructure, and not enough coverage because of the infrastructure that you could create a go-to-market where the economics actually worked.
So it's the triple whammy.
It's the triple whammy, but
suckiness.
if you actually unpack each of those, they're in theory solvable. It just hasn't been done. So I want it to happen, but it has not been done.
So how do we, and I'm going to open this up to the whole panel, how do we create a culture in healthcare where we talk about this stuff? Because it feels like we go on stage at conferences like these and we talk about all the great things that we're doing and all the wins, and you know, it's sometimes true, but there is so much to be learned and gleaned from people who've gone out and really struggled and went down a path that just didn't work out. And you know, how do we start to build more of that into these sorts of events? And maybe this is the change right here on the stage. But yeah, just really curious for thoughts there about why we don't do that more often.
You know, it's really interesting as a newcomer into the life sciences space. I felt incredibly privileged to be part of an organization like Flagship Pioneering. And what that really enabled me to do was actually go around and actually spend time with like 30, 40 other CEOs to figure out what were all those learnings. And for me, that was totally transformational in terms of, especially an industry where a platform typically meant a modality. It didn't mean, right, networked learning at scale. The fact that you only get rewarded for the asset, that's typically what people care about. And so from the beginning, right, it's really hard in a therapeutics industry where the learning periods are like 10 years, right, from beginning to end. And often CEOs are changed a couple of times during that. Then learning doesn't get institutionalized. So I do think seeking out people that have been around the block 2 or 3 times and asking them, what do you wish you knew about how to develop your product? What are those repeated? And I got my list of like 15 things that I did not want to fall into the trap of. And it really helped me bring the best of what I'd learned in technology. But how do I think about applying that in a way that can enable that network learning concept to be viable both economically and developmentally in a brand new industry? And I think we often don't spend enough time asking those hard questions, and people are very willing to share because they want solutions to come out. That's why people went down these roads. And so I can't emphasize enough how valuable that's been for me and how much I think we need to do that.
And if somebody asked you, like grabbed you after this panel, what would be the one thing you would share?
From that? Oh, absolutely. The most important single thing, and it sounds so obvious, but in therapeutics, avoid binary risk, right? You always want to have as much optionality as possible because you only want to move to the clinic, which is where you put the biggest investment, the most and best possible things that you put in there. And most of these companies, even if they have a great platform, you go to the clinic and that first thing fails, the whole company goes down. You see it all the time in the market. And it's so obvious, yet we often don't structure companies that way. That's why we're advancing 10 targets and molecule pools at once, so that we always focus on advancing the best possible solutions. And we had to engineer a company and an approach that enables us to do that.
Okay, I'm going to pivot slightly then, just to kind of grill everybody else on the one thing, because I think this is really important and a huge value add for the audience. Sean, you want to start?
Well, yeah, I want to answer your question too about how might we create a world where a specific dialogue on the challenges is more, more of a fit for a panel like this. So I think the first is to remind people that healthcare is very irregularly a zero-sum game. I mean, these markets are so enormous. I'm friends with most of the competitors in our space. And I mean, Omada, we just crossed 1 million enrollments. We're super proud of that. It just happened. I remember the struggle it took to get to 3,000. But that's 1 million people. 1 million. That is a drop in the bucket of the prevalence of metabolic diseases. We've literally done nothing. So it's reminding that it's a zero-sum game, I think is kind of important. And then finding the challenges, which we just caught on one, which are hyper-specific, but unanimous across everybody. That's not, so like pricing would be a good one. That would be my answer on like if a founder's in the audience on pricing. Make sure you know that when you price and package your product, you need to design for the procurement team that at the end of the day brings you through and has corporate goals to shave off, 10 to 15%. Like, there's this whole enterprise buying motion that you need to understand before you think about pricing and packaging your product that I had no idea existed when I founded the company.
What's the first step to be able to even get access to all that information?
What's the first step to what?
Just even finding out about, like, who do you talk to even get that information?
Now, the good thing, and I'd be curious if the other panelists here agree, is I found the digital health entrepreneurship community but to be extraordinarily giving. It's very irregular where if I'm thinking about something or have a particular struggle that I can't lean on another CEO in the space and kind of ask, hey, how have you unpacked that? I feel like it's hopefully a uniquely giving space.
I would agree. I was actually thinking back as you were asking the question, Chrissy, around my own journey a little bit as both founder and CEO over the last 8 years with dozens of copycat companies that have come after us. And I would say in my early years, I really was quite affronted by it, right? Like I was affected, I didn't love it, and I just was really frustrated by it. And there was a turning point maybe 5 years ago where I actually proactively reach out. I advise a lot of the companies. I try to offer early learnings because so many consumer companies have failed. And it's so hard to be a point solution. And ultimately, I'm not sure I believe in the point solution model, which was a big reason why we actually started broad. I got a lot of negative feedback about being broad and not just focusing on one condition. But a lot of companies are bringing interesting assays to market, focusing on specific populations, and whether or not they succeed individually, or frankly, they become a product that we can bring under our umbrella. It's not necessarily entirely altruistic, but it's a way for us to help build the ecosystem. And so I think my own learning as a leader has really evolved in that way. And I would agree with Sean. I mean, almost every CEO I talk to, we can talk about specific tough issues. For us, it would be entirely shifting our mental model, our product offering, and our own procurement and economic strategy around enterprise. And how do you find the right people to help you do that? We're well diversified now, about 50-50, so 50% consumer, 50% enterprise clients, but that was a massive undertaking and one that wasn't natural to me. And I had to rely on a lot of people in this space and frankly, a lot of great talent that could help get us there.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things I think naturally in tech that we're kind of trained, that Andy Grove, only the paranoid survive mindset. And there's a technique that we developed at Google. Once a quarter, there would be a small group of people that would go off and spend like a couple of days literally attacking the first principles of the business model and say, what could actually knock us off our path? Either a new technology innovation, a new competitor that pivots, a combination of competitors. What was that? And what made that so valuable is it made you look outside of yourself constantly and challenge those principles. And I think that's a huge opportunity in the healthcare space, is to constantly ask, are you curiosity? If you're the CEO, are you leading heads up or heads down? Are you out meeting at least a couple times a week with people that are adjacent or orthogonal in your space that constantly forces you to check back and reframe those assumptions? Because I think we all get huge commitment bias, but the world around us is constantly shifting. I know I find that to be super true, right? There's a ton of people that are doing AI and small molecules. There's a ton of natural products companies. And I have to keep asking myself, is the way we're approaching this really distinctive? Are we truly differentiated and a scalable approach to this? Should we actually scaffold on top of what someone else is doing to go there even faster? Where can you collaborate, as Julie was saying? And I think that's something we historically have not done as much of in health. And I think we have to if we're going to make leaps.
Yeah, I would add to that, again, coming from the outside in, there's a lot of lessons to be learned in companies and industries that have gone through transformations that have been somewhat successful. Maybe not in solving the problems that they set out to solve, but in bringing the right coalition of the willing to say, in order to really affect change. And the two that come to mind as I hear my fellow panelists talk, one is the cybersecurity world, where I spent many years in before coming to Verily. And I think the public-private partnership between government agencies and private institutions to bring innovation, to bring frameworks like they did with NIST and others, that companies can play their part, but they're not trying to play a part that they also need municipalities and resources from their respective governments to participate in. And a lot of great work has been done over the last 15 years there that I think healthcare can learn from. The other one is the technology disruption. If you go back 20 years, a lot of the tech companies, particularly Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Amazon in particular, brought very disruptive and new technologies to market. For those that know what AWS is, raise your hand. Everyone should know. Amazon built a capability in the process of building their own business, and then took that capability and brought it to the world, and in many ways brought the world with it. And if Amazon or Google or Microsoft cloud services go down today, half the internet goes offline, as do half of companies. And I think that's another example that if you want to go fast, you kind of go by yourself, and if you want to go far, you bring people with you. And I think this transformation of healthcare really should abide by that, which is have a little bit of humility. Don't put the history of healthcare, its past, at war with its future, and saying everything that came before this generation of innovation is horrible and bad and inefficient. Find the examples where critical mass and change were reached. Build on that as our organizations. Have a little bit of humility. It's not going to be technology solves everything, nor is regulation going to solve everything, nor you have to bring the coalition together, and then you together go far, and I think can really affect this change. And the companies that are represented here and others I've seen in Verily are taking that disposition to say, we have our thing, it's important, we can do things that are unique and differentiated, but a part of you in your mind should say, how do we partner up with others in order to make sure we go far? And that's a public-private and a sense of humility that I think we need.
So I'm going to ask a slightly different question and maybe get a show of hands from the audience. Has anyone seen the new BlackBerry movie? Raise your hand if you've seen it. Okay. So this is, nobody on the panel's seen it.
I have.
Oh, you have? Okay. I just watched it on the plane coming here. It's definitely worth seeing, but it is the film about the first mover, because BlackBerry at one point had 40% penetration into the market. Now it has 0%. And most of that down to the iPhone, which completely crushed BlackBerry. But it was fascinating to see how that founder really had that innovation of being able to connect, that would come up with the original idea of the smartphone. It was the idea of having internet on your phone, being able to send an email. You could do it all at once. But there was some innovation at some point that they didn't see, which is where Steve Jobs came along and utterly crushed them. And I think about that too with all of you and the companies that you have, is like, how do you know as a founder, like there's a point where things are going to be going quite swimmingly, but you still need to pivot because someone else has seen that things are going swimmingly and will come in and do it better than you. And I'm reminded of, at least in the, Julia, at one point you and I talked about how you were doing very well on consumer, particularly in COVID, but pivoted to enterprise. So I thought of that, but I'm sure there are many other examples on this stage. So can you speak to that challenge? Because you almost need a crystal ball. I don't know how founders kind of work their way through that.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to say I had a crystal ball. It was partially luck and partially data informed. So obviously in 2020, Everly had a record year, but what I would say here is that even ex-COVID, our core business had grown multiples and was continuing to grow multiples. And so there was really no reason per se, if you looked at all of our metrics, to really make this push into enterprise.
And if I'm your VC, I'm like, keep doing what you're doing.
Right. And frankly, there was a massive undertaking in the company to scale to support COVID. We ended up collectively through the pandemic only running a slightly smaller number of tests than Quest and LabCorp. So to give you context for how much we were supporting, it was very substantial. And so there was a lot of distraction. And ultimately, we went out to raise our Series D, and we got some investor feedback, and playing the long game, looking far out, we were going to be really discounted because we were 100% consumer. In parallel, we had actually delivered a really nice product to a Medicare plan that delivered double the engagement, much better outcomes than the competitor, and it was still going to take us years, I would posit over a decade, to be able to grow that business to scale. And so we went out and, using both our own experience as well as that feedback, and made a number of acquisitions that allowed us to essentially drive our digital solution through a book of business that already existed. And so we've been able to nicely build on that and continue to do so. I think we're going to have our largest enterprise month ever this month. And so that was really, I think, listening. And as a founder, setting aside ego, not having any sacred cows, being able to say, what do I want for the long term of this business? And I wanted it to be a generational business that stood the test of time. I wasn't looking to sell. I wasn't looking to get out quickly. And whether or not it was me leading, the business needed to exist. And so that was really the driver behind it.
I think what you're getting at, it is substantially harder in enterprise healthcare. I think the feedback that you can get is on a longer time horizon if you just look at the accountability of the metrics. I mean, if you're a consumer company, you're BlackBerry, you just see your sales start to shrink immediately. With long sales cycles and the complexity of healthcare, it can take a little bit more time. I think the counsel I'd offer is just constantly think about the big meta trends. It could be regulatory trends, it could be insurance mix trends, it could be technological trends, and just if there's one that you're like, this is really meaningful to the business, like stay on it, make sure to think 3 years out. I mean, we're experiencing one right now, GLP-1s.
I was just going to ask,
massive,
how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, massive change to the space. It's I think about it constantly. I love our strategy against it, but it's one where you're not going to see it really appear for years in Omada's trajectory and how we're thinking about this, but it's enormous, it's meaningful, and we have to think about it within the context of what we do.
Yeah, I think a good example in life sciences is the pivot I was talking about, where 3 or 4 years ago, very easy to raise capital with a platform idea, and there was a lot of patience. That entire mindset has shifted. And so as a leader, we had to quickly pivot the company to thinking about how do we, even though we have this bolder platform vision to create this incredible network concept of matching of human biology and this human qualified chemistry, and building that network as big as it can possibly be on the path ultimately to true personalized solutions. We were talking earlier about these pathways are all connected: asthma, atopic dermatitis, right? Yet we are treated as separate individuals in that course. So that is our ultimate vision as we scale our knowledge. But the reality of where the business is today is we have to be able to deliver phenomenal assets today to the market and be able to drive non-dilutive capital by doing that for a wide range of existing targets that exist, and also have partnerships in the pharma space. And so we really have that long-term vision, but we're thinking about how do we break it down and get after it in chunks that prove the long-term vision, but also give us the kind of economic return that our investors expect today. And I think that's really what it's about as a leader, is you take those signals, you don't change your strategy, you make sure it's still taking you on the path, but you're willing to make those hard choices, right? For long-term success.
No, I think that's well said. And as you were talking, I was thinking, I've had my journey, I've had the chance to be a part of some pretty extraordinary teams. Prior to where I was an offensive guard for the Oregon Ducks. By the way, I'm giving this chair a 50% chance of holding me till the end of the season. Never been on an inflatable chair before, so.
Don't worry, we got some docs.
All right, so if I tumble off, you guys get me. But we were a winning team, and we were number 1 in the Pac-10. That used to be a conference that has been thoroughly destroyed since then. And I went to corporate America and joined a couple transformations that were quite successful, but were very hard getting there. And if you think about BlackBerry, not just BlackBerry, think about companies like Atari. Atari, I think, at one point in the 80s, had the largest market cap of any company in the US, and now they're just a meme that my kids send me. So if you think about winning, so back to the BlackBerry, you have to make some assumptions as a leader. One, there's no perpetually good company, and there's no
100%.
Perpetually good industry. And you need to prepare for the worst when you're at your best. You don't wait until they launch the iPhone or whatever the sequence of things happen to take them off their throne. You have to constantly reinvent yourself, and you have to particularly do it when everyone's telling you how great you are. And so if you take that mindset, I think Jack Welch said it best in one of his books, I think it was called Winning. He said, if the rate of change outside your company is faster than the rate of change inside your company, the end is near. And I think that is a great way to summarize how you have to be disruptive to yourself and to innovate. And Apple, for example, during the post-dot-com crash, while every company was retreating and lowering investment and backing off of their offerings, Apple was quietly working on a capability that later launched as iTunes and the iPod. So they took a moment when everyone was in retreat to be on the offensive and innovate and disrupt themselves in a way, and then later disrupted the iPod themselves with the iPhone. So I think that's how I think about it as a leader, and I'm constantly thinking, is the bullet in the air for my business, and when is it going to hit me, and how do I make sure that I bring the leadership and the culture in order to reinvent and disrupt ourselves where we need to.
Okay, so speaking of, we're actually like, I think at the same time there's an AI panel, and I've heard that, you know, AI is basically the only thing keeping San Francisco real estate afloat right now, because these are the only companies that can raise money. So in this new era where this is all we want to talk about and all we want to fund, what is the importance of jumping on the proverbial hype bandwagon? Like, do you run at this and say, I'm the anti-AI company, and that's the strategy because you want to be different, you want to stand out, and like, you know, maybe you're not going to be, maybe you're like Apple, you're going to run and do something else? Or is it when everyone's talking about something and excited about something, do you want to be a part of it because you want to get some gains associated with that? I'm just curious what everybody here thinks on the panel, and I think it's something that we're all wrestling with right now.
I think it's been practical. So I remember during the blockchain crypto NFT era, you know, when your 80-year-old aunt calls you about should she buy Bitcoin, you're probably too late to think about buying it yourself. And Gartner, which is an analyst community, has a great chart called the hype cycle. It talks about, you know, mass hype and then the trough of disillusionment. And usually these technologies follow this curve. And I think with AI, it's an important critical tool. We are investing a lot against it, but it needs to find its equilibrium with reality. I remember, I think it was called Long Island Iced Tea Company, renamed itself to Long Island Bitcoin Iced Tea Company, and their stock, Google it, their stock went up hundreds of % on the news that they were now going to be a Bitcoin iced tea company. That's max hype stuff as far as I'm concerned. But I think with AI, we have a chance for it to be quite disruptive as a tool. So the technology plus the clinician does something that neither one could do or probably should do long term on their own.
What do you think, Sean AI Duffy?
You know, if you just jump into the hype for hype's sake, you'll feel rudderless, not just to the external world, to your employees. So, but if you identify the hype and you think critically, well, within that hype, is there substance? Usually things that are well hype have some substance. So you have to find it, be explicit about it, be thoughtful about it, shows how it benefits your customers, your members, and then shout that from the rooftops. I think that's the tactic.
I don't know. For me, I think about, you know, each one of these big platform transformations. So I think about AI is like mobile or the internet. Before it, there are going to be a few winners on the infrastructure side, right? Just like there was there. And then there's going to be a massive amount of value created on applications. And those will fit into logical buckets, right? You know, there'll be a lot of productivity gains. And there's probably no company that will not see benefit on that productivity side. Whether it's just making your compute people more productive, or it's just getting rid of a repetitive task where you have a hard time hiring people to do that. But where I think the really exciting leaps are coming from is where you're able to integrate multiple data signals to come up with and find things that you couldn't have done before. And I think that's where, you know, the transformational value will be created. And that's the kind of leap that we're really focusing on, right? We start with that hard problem. How do we drug these really important pathways? How do we do it safely? How do we do it with small molecule, a pill a day? Because that's what we all want. And molecules with a provenance of human safety, you actually know where it came from, just like your food. And so these are things that I think AI can uniquely solve for us. And I think we have to push ourselves to those frontiers while taking some of those other productivity benefits along the way.
I'll be quick, which is I think the company and founder hype follows the investor hype. And so while there will be substantial benefits from AI, we just got through this cycle in digital health. And we are now getting back into it watching AI. And so maybe another well-learned founder lesson is to make sure that your value proposition is true to your company and not to get caught up in the VC investor cycle. Because at the end of the day, you are the company and the founder left holding the bag when that goes away.
Amen.
And as a VC, I will say thank you for that advice. And hopefully we will learn something today from this panel. Thank you for your candor. And thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.